whatever comes up, we need to carefully examine and find out what is the truth. After all, the reason why we're on any kind of search, whether it be a scientific search, or be it an inward search, or be it a psychological search, is to find out what is true. And so we have a good instrumentation for that. We have the capacity to evaluate certain facts. And so I think this was an experiment done in 1900 and something, 1907, was it? Yeah? Mm-hmm. And 6 people were taken, and he thought the soul was something material. So really the question rephrased is what we understand to be the soul, is it material? Is it as material as a body? Or what is the distinction between what we call Atman and Jiva, that is, an internal divine essential self, and something that has more psychological implications, some accumulation of experience that we have that is seen to carry forward in some traditions. Some traditions means that if you want to find out what is generally understood to be an animating thing, something that gives life to something. So we view this idea of a soul as an animus or anima, or something that animates something. Something that gives life to something. Similar meaning as we have jiva, something that gives life to something, or something that is living. So what makes a distinction between a corpse and something which is living? And this we describe as jivas. Jivas, something which is temporary, no doubt, in its nature, and yet there's a permanence to it as well. And so it has a carry forward in terms of time. The example is always, if I'm going to a destination, let's say the airport, and in a taxi, my taxi breaks down, what will I do? Well, maybe I should just take another taxi and transfer my baggage. Baggage is very useful psychological speech. Transfer all my experiences across and continue the journey. The fact that something separate from me, called a taxi, broke down, should not inhibit my journey. That's the idea. And then when we talk about all these various categories as we have described, 24 categories or so, we can extend that a little bit. Maybe one of these categories we can make jiva. And then jiva's relationship between a supreme principle falls into 3 basic categories. Either I feel that I am separate from this supreme principle, and I require grace to flow by means of love. And love is my way of tapping into it. That's one understanding. But then as that opens up and deepens, in other words, as I discover truth and reality more and more and more, then I come to a feeling, not just a philosophical conclusion, that I'm neither connected nor disconnected. Something that technically is called abheda, something that is, I'm neither one with it, nor am I separate from it. Like a spark, as it were, a kind of connectedness. There's another philosophical school, another way of thinking, what is this relationship between this apparently separated jiva and a supreme principle. And the final conclusion, experientially, that I have is, in Jesus' language, I and the Father are one. There's no difference. Firstly, the kingdom of heaven is within me, and then we go to Jesus' statement, I am the vine and you are the branches, this connectedness, and then ultimately, I am one. I and the Father are one. Not seem to be in any way contradictory. Seem to be different positions of understanding that become deeper and deeper as our experience gets more and more, in other words, as a revelation more and more occurs. Bearing in mind that the understanding is the truth is always existent here. It doesn't require acquisition or changing. It simply requires uncovering. And what is in the way is ignorance. So, does the soul have some physicality to it? It acquires a physicality, no doubt. But it comes from the experiment. It comes from this idea that soul is a physical thing. And to prove its existence, we have to see, is there any weight difference when a body dies or afterwards? Even if there were a weight difference, And you can't say because this 21 gram difference came from 1 out of 6. And then the thinking was, do dogs or other animals have a soul? And Christian theology maybe may say, I don't know, some of it might say, no, animals can't have souls. That means we can happily eat meat without any negative impact on our conscience, because it's just there for our enjoyment. And so dogs, I think, in the experiment were also weighed. And it was found there was no weight loss in the dogs. And so the conclusion is, dogs don't have this soul. And 1 out of 6 humans have a 21 gram difference. Therefore, the soul weighs 21 grams. Therefore, from 1907 to 2019, as with any conspiracy theory, a large section of conspiracists will say, oh, you know what? There is a soul. Why? We weighed it. Who's the we? Where was the laboratory? Where was the experiment? So all of these things we have to examine very closely. And the more we examine, the more we find the reality of those who have some kind of insight at a very deep fundamental level. After all, if we want insight about this world, we can get it through examination, through scientific methodology. But if we want a foundational understanding, we have to go deeper. And so the book that we are studying is Bhagavad Gita. And for those who require an introduction, we can introduce it by way of a prayer. Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanura Vardhanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagatgurum. So we salute Krishna, son of Vasudeva, destroyer of Kamsa and Chanura, supreme delight of Devaki, God himself and the Guru of the universe. We left off last week. I'm never quite sure where we leave off, by the way, so I might repeat a few things. But the subject for the last week and carried over to this week is the subject of death and dying. Because all of us have this concern, basic concern, centered around this original question to some extent. What happens to me when I die? And I've described 3 positions. So from the one position which we may describe as non-dualistic, how Jesus described it, I am the Father are one. This one imperishable principle is there, and this whole chapter that we're studying is Akshara Brahma, that is the imperishable Brahman, the imperishable supreme principle, knowing that everything else has perishable parts, eliminating all of that, what is that remains and does not have this characteristic? That must surely be the supreme principle, because if you have another supreme principle which has some characteristic of change in it or perishability in it, then we have to look for another supreme principle. There has to be some absolute stance. Even in understanding who am I, there must be a final datum beyond which we can't go. Some ultimate seer of all our experiences that cannot itself be seen. Some witness, some intrinsic witness, knower, thinker in one, that is the source not only of the witnessing, but also acts as the source of the consciousness, a subjective thing that can be witnessed into a molded consciousness and molded objects. And so we also discussed last week how in examining saintly lives, even the week before we mentioned it, how to see or to get a clue into what we might describe as an art of dying. Knowing that will happen to us one day, should there be some method that we use that has this peacefulness to it? Some people optimistic say, oh, my mother died, she had a happy death. But what they mean is they're glossing over their own sadness about it. And so how do we get to this point? We have to take the highest examples, namely these yogis.
Sorry, Swami, can I just ask you, was it 1 in 6 had a weight difference
I think so, but I'm not bothering too much about it.
That means the other 5 didn't have a soul.
I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, everybody has a soul and it's completely weightless.
Ditto. I would have thought
Yeah. See, how can you measure experience? How can you measure what is essentially the mind that produces meaning? And if you say that we'll give it a physicality and say the mind is the brain, that's something different. And the materialist will have that point of view. But it doesn't explain how a conscious entity comes. So how do we explain it? We explain it by saying that there is a principle which is pure consciousness that manifests itself in some way as a cosmic mind. And that becomes a creative principle. From its thought comes the whole universe. Now every religion agrees on this, but most religions, or many religions, may stop there and not find out, is there another 2 principles in our case? Is there a principle from which that comes? And then is there some ultimate principle where no movement takes place? Because the awkward question about a creator and the creation is, well, you say it comes from nothing, so, but something must be there, so where's the second-hand shop that God went to make the world and the universe, and then who made that, and who made that, and that's how it goes on. So there must be a better way of looking at it. And eliminating the word creator and creation is one way, and saying there's a manifestation that takes place, there's a different meaning. It means that the source, the cause, is both the material and the effective cause. And the example given in the Upanishads is like a spider weaving a web from itself. It doesn't require a Mrs. Spider to do it. See, hair grows on the body. See, we don't have to have a particular creator of hair. The body itself produces it. Something like that. So there are analogies that we can use to understand this concept. So when we look at the universe and the world, and some of this may be strange for you, and so I rely on your questions. If you are not clear about things, I rely on your questions, particularly if you're here for the first time, because we're assuming many things. We're assuming that you understand a lot of what has been told before, and that may not be justified. So please take a mental note of your questions, and hold on to your questions, I would suggest, until we finished the subject, and then bring out your questions. Because as we go on, there may be questions on questions on questions also. And so, how the yogi relinquishes the body is an interesting subject that is entered into. That is, is there a supreme example in terms of how you can give the body up? Now, we know that yogis have this capacity to withdraw from the body. So if we talk about a jiva or a soul or any of these things, a real entity, let's say, within the body, some occupier of something, just as a hand can occupy a glove, and not being the glove can withdraw from it. Just as a driver can choose to go into the car and leave it off. Park it, it doesn't do any harm, we leave it there, pick it up again, and make a function from it. The principle that something must have parts infers some other entity independent of it that is using it. And so I know I'm not the car, I know I'm not the door has so many parts, hinges and handles and so on. Not so that its component parts can get up and have a party while I'm sleeping. And then as I open the door, you see these various component parts reassemble. But it's for my use so that I independently can walk through it. Same thing with a car with so many parts. The human body has some seemingly 60-70 trillion parts. We call them cells, biological cells. The mind has various parts which we can divide for functional purpose. And so, when we come to this, and I think we covered this last week, we said that there is, and these two stanzas are normally taken together, and I think I read out the stanzas anyway, so I'll cover this briefly. The omniscient, the ancient, the ruler, the minuter than the atom, supporter of all, inconceivable, effulgent like the sun, and beyond all darkness, he who meditates on this resplendent, supreme Purusha. That is, when we say supreme Purusha, in this context, we're not talking of the ultimate principle. We're talking of a Saguna Brahman, a more of a personal God. At the time of death, with a steady mind, these are the conditions. So how do we develop a steady mind is a question. With devotion and strength of yoga. And then this understanding, well fixing the entire prana in the middle of the eyebrows, it reaches him. So let us explore what this means. But it's worthwhile repeating maybe what we mean by these various descriptive terms. Kavi is a very, very interesting term, a very beautiful term, because literally it infers a poet and poetry. And so it implies an omniscience. It's translated as omniscient in English here. But it implies that there is an intelligence behind everything. Previously we were discussing a little bit, is there an intelligence behind this universe? According to this, there is some entity whose penetrating intelligence gives intelligence to the universe. I think I mentioned last week that the great biologist, writing in his book, it's in his first book, I think it is, that is The Blind Watchmaker, Richard Dawkins, famous atheistic biologist. And he said, things look designed. They appear to be designed. They appear that there is a designer. Of course, his conclusion is there's not. So an appearance is there. As a scapegoat, if something appears to be there, then why not just go the whole way? And as modern people interested in the design element to this might say, well, not only does it appear to be designed, why not say it is designed? That means there must be some intelligence there, without which, how can we come to a culmination at the end of an evolutionary process, a long evolutionary process, to a conscious thinking man who is able to make decisions, able to make evaluations, able to execute things, able to have a will, able to exert some kind of motivation, able to bring up these questions in the first place. It's a wonderful marvel in the 20th, 21st century how many discoveries in modern physics have led to applied science, where all those discoveries are now being applied for the, we might say, the convenience and improvement of the lifestyle of human beings, including this camera, the internet that we're using, including this computer here, and the cell phone, and all of these are inventions that come off scientific discoveries, starting off with basic hypotheses and principles, and testing and testability, and then applying it. And the application itself is proof that it works. And so these various things are said, is Purana, the ancient one. How ancient? How ancient is the universe? According to modern cosmological theories, 13.7 billion years. Some people may contest these models, but let's say 13.7 billion years. Let's not argue with standard cosmology. Well, what stands there is more ancient than that. Before this universe came to being, that entity stood there and, as it were, wove a cocoon around itself and entered into it, is a description, and became an inner controller, that kind of thing. And then a ruler, designing all the structures and rhythms and all the intricacies. This human body alone has easily over 20 different independent machines within it, mechanically engineered things and processes within it. And then Anushasita, that's the ruler, and then subtlest of the subtle, Anuranyan. There is nothing finer than pure consciousness. And yet we find the most subtle things that we know of. We can even say subtler than the atom. How big is the atom? And how vast is it at the same time? Just give you some idea. You don't know it, but this human body of yours that you think is solid and you think is independently, intellectually wealthy and so on, and the way it looks is hugely important. If you take its body mass, it's hardly anything. That means if you take the whole 7 billion people in the entire universe and remove all the air from it, all the empty space from it actually, take all of that and compress it down, suck it down into one single concentrated mass, it would be the size of a moderately sized apple. You are mainly air. Some may unkindly say hot air. But that's okay, you know. So we are mainly air, physiologically air, that's all. Supposing you say, what is this body and other things that we know of to do with matter comprised of? We say atoms. Well, the atomic structure, as we know, has a nucleus. Supposing that nucleus was the size of a football, let's say a ball this size, then we know that, of course, an atom is made up of a nucleus. We've described it there. That's its kind of size. Let's make it a sphere. Imagine now there has to be, as you know, electrons around it. And the electrons are antisocial. They can only occupy, one place at a time. Where is the nearest electron to this nucleus? Take a guess.
Couple of thousand miles.
Couple of thousand miles. Oh, well, okay, no, it's not that great. No, about half a mile. About half a mile. Still half a mile, you see. You put it in kilometers, it's about 4.5 kilometers, nearly 5 kilometers actually, 4.8 kilometers I think is the exact thing. So that means, you see, that if you now scale it up and say, okay, what's the equivalent of a human? We take that one football and maybe times it by 10. Then the nearest will be something like, something like several kilometers away, 4.5 kilometers away, something like that. That's the scale of it. So we would like that here, it'll be something like, I correct myself, 0.8 of a kilometer. But if you scale it up by 10, then it's about 8 kilometers. Yeah, 8 kilometers away. Yeah. So 8 kilometers away. That's nearly from here to the city center. We're 2/3 of the way to the city center. Now imagine somebody there shouting at you here, saying, hey, I'm here, I'm an electron. See that level of communication. And what's in the way? Empty space. There's nothing in the way. So completely empty. So the conclusion is things are empty. If you take the whole universe itself, the whole mass of the universe is something like, or the density, I should say, of the universe is something like 20 drops diluted in something like a billion liters of water, or a billion cubic miles, put it in volume. A billion cubic miles. What an amazing thing. What's in the way? It's just empty space. No big deal about it. So that puts everything in a little bit of context, that everything is subtle, actually at the fundamental level, but subtlest of all is this supreme principle. Is a support, incomprehensible, achintya rupa. How can you describe this entity? You see, we can, even if we go and describe it from the point of view of Brahman, in a conversation in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, we say the supreme principle described in negative terms. It doesn't have this, it doesn't have that, it doesn't have that. How will you describe such a thing? Incomprehensible. From there the mind comes back, words come back together with the mind is the description. And so some name has to be applied to it. And so we call this Brahman, which indicates some kind of eternal expansion. And then, of course, tamasa parastat is the state of the Paramatma being supremely above the darkness of ignorance. Most of what we experience is ignorant. So all of these things are mentioned in connection with this. And then when we come to this beautiful description about how the yogi will fix this through a yogic technique of pranayama, control of energy, life energy, and how that entity will bring it up, as it were, elevate it to a position fixed between the eyebrows in yogic language and concepts called Ajna Chakra. So fixing it there, and we know that that is symbolic and representative of this Ishvara, this universal Lord, fixing it there. That means voluntarily taking the whole energy and fixing it there, internally saying, I'm ready, reaches Him. What is the Him? This is this personal God, this personal entity, whose realm would be something like what is described as Brahmaloka. Then what is the course? The course will be to stay there, and in the next cycle of things, where everything dissolves for a prolonged period of time. What period of time? We were discussing it earlier. So 4.3 billion human years will be one complete cycle of 4 ages, summed up. One day of Brahma, one day of the Creator, call it that for the time being, the manifest of the Creator, the author, the cosmic mind, where everything moves from, is you have to do 1,000 times that. So 4.3 times 1,000, I'll leave you mathematicians to work it out in trillions. So that is one day where everything now goes back into a kind of cosmic sleep. And then another period of time, same period of time for sleeping, and then coming out again, emerging again. You have to go through 100 years of that to go completely into this dissolution of the absolute supreme principle. So this gives you a mind-boggling idea of the scale of things. So that a man like late Carl Sagan said, only in this system will you find a realistic idea of eons and eons and eons of time. In no other ancient system will you find it. According to, I think it was Bishop Berkeley, was it? Who came up with this idea, make a calculation of so-and-so begat so-and-so, and all of that, and then came to a conclusion that this world is 6,000 years old. It has to be like that. And on the basis of that, many difficult concepts coming out, such as including Aryan invasion and so on, all kinds of things like that, based on this one thing. So this life energy comes up. We can see it in our own tradition. That is, we can see it in the life and death of Swami Vivekananda, who as soon as he, according to his prediction of his own mother, realized his own master, realized who he was, voluntarily, as it were, withdrew from the body, like a hand from the glove. With all the clues of the day, nowhere in sight. Only in the afterthought we find that there was some significance, a private moment, an extended moment in the shrine room with locked doors. Some statements not really fully understood at the time. And then a vigorous programming that included a walk, that included a meal. And then finally, selecting the 4th of July for this. That is American Independence Day, being inspired by the democratic system, the freedom, the Catholicity of the new founded, really, American nation. See how that happens. So yogis can do this. Why not? Why not? Because I'm not the body. And what isn't there and is withdrawn has no weight to it, let alone 21 grams. Weightless, indescribable, having no characteristics, nothing like that. So we'll pick this up then at the 10th stanza. Yadaksharam vedavido vadanti vishanti yad yatayo vitaraga yad ichanto brahmacharyam charanti tatte padam samgrehena pravakshe. We find this yad ichanto brahmacharyam charanti echoed in the Kathopanishad. So, what does this mean? That which the knowers of the Veda call the imperishable, that is the knower of the truth, call the imperishable. All scripture, the scripture is deemed Veda not as a script, but as an eternal truth that is discovered. So, that which the knowers of this call this akshara, this imperishable entity, and into which they enter those sannyasins. That means those ascetics. Those ascetics who realize now this imperishable aspect, not the personal aspect, or maybe inclusive of the personal aspect. Self-control is the requirement, free from attachment, and desiring which they lead a life of brahmacharya. That needs to be explained. So in the ancient days, brahmacharya was a stage in life of studentship, requiring self-control, self-discipline, and servitude. Character-building phase of a life. Most often seen as the years between 12 and 24. So the whole of life divided into 4 sections. We assume we live 100 years, and there being a principal drive in life toward a certain purpose. That purpose characterized variously as freedom, freedom from bondage, freedom from pain, freedom from desire and its consequences. And so, what is the first thing? We have to learn dharma. Don't forget, this is also 4 aims are there. And one aim is dharma, the thing that brings everything knitted well together and harmonious. And so, how do you become a good citizen? How do you lead a harmonious life? It requires discipline. It requires self-control. And the earlier we learn it, the better. The first 12 years of your life, your teachers are your own parents, or whoever plays the parental role. That's very significant, even today. Children learn primarily by example. I often say, if you want a little child to be helpful and useful, don't say anything. Merely sweep the floor, and before long the 4-year-old will say, "Where's my little broom?" and will want to also sweep the floor. So example is the best teacher. And then from 12, where thinking comes in, questioning comes in, as certain individuality starts forming, is necessary to have character formation. Traditionally, those students would go into a pristine environment where traditionally a teacher and his wife lived in the forest, ashram, an academic environment that was in nature, and husbandry was taking place, such as looking after cows. So milking cows was required, cleaning was required, cooking was required, serving was required. All aimed at self-control, discipline. In addition to that, learning took place. And the only learning available was the Vedas. In that was contained all the truth. And so this period of brahmacharya was eventually understood to be continence. Continence, chastity, purity. Without this purity as a universal value, nothing else can take place. No further spiritual evolution can take place. Patanjali Yoga Sutras includes this as one of his 5 universal moral principles, part of the moral training, that there must be this self-control. And indeed, if we say that there is a certain allocation, as it were, of energy, we can view it like that. It's not exactly like that. We can view this eruption in the universe as an individual being an occasion for a kind of vortex of energy to find its way around. Consciously taking that energy away from diversions and scatteredness, And I mentioned how modern science has provided us with an implied version of it, applied science that has become useful to us, but it will also be against us. It can be a distraction. Modern cell phone is a wonderful way of communicating. Our whole life has changed as a result. But it's also lent itself to what can be called, at best, thumb exercises. Walking distractedly, doing these thumb exercises, not concentrating on what you're doing. And so the opportunity for distraction can also be more. There's a downside to it as well. But if we want to take it and take its advantages and decide to use it in a useful way, a way that leads us to an opening, a way that leads us to a greater understanding of truth, a greater avenue toward a greater freedom, then that will be useful to us. So taking all of this, what is described by the yogis as ojas, all this energy and rediverting it. In the yogic language, it means awakening our own inner energy, our own version of prana, localized within us, which is coiled up in us, our coiled up potential that can be unfolded. We can also imagine it as the unfolding of our potentiality in our DNA that expresses itself with something like 100,000 coded messages, something like 1,000-volume encyclopedia that can be read. That amount of information contained, whatever you were, whatever you are, whatever you will be, is contained in that coiled up situation. Coincidentally, if you will, coiled up like two snakes in the winged Mercury, like the symbol of the medical health. That kind of idea. And we can see it all modeled so well, so intricately, and so compactly also. Our will can change it. Our environment changes it, but we change our environment. And in turn, that same DNA can be modified, giving us an understanding that to this extent we have a free will. Free will means that we can choose something different. And in choosing something different, away from ignorance, away from the thing that is blocking us, can be a way to open up all these levels of the mind, all these levels of consciousness, in yogic language, these chakras within us, until finally we get this ultimate awakening. And so this method of conserving this energy and redirecting it is very, very important essence and is specifically mentioned for those people who take this sannyas path. And Ramakrishna mentions it like this: he who wants to become spiritual should not lustfully look at even the picture of a woman. Spirituality is not where lust is. The sadhaka, that is the spiritual practitioner, established in this brahmacharya, develops a faculty known as meda, which promotes a spiritual knowledge, a kind of extra limb, if you will, a kind of extra nerve, if you will, that awakens. And so we have then, we'll deal with these two together, 12 and 13. So, sarva dvarani samyamya manohridi nirudhya cha mardna dayatmanaha pranam astito yogatha pranam. Om, because that's what's in relation to, Om ityet akaksharam brahma vyaharam mam anusmaram ya prayati tyajan deham sayati paramam gatim. You'll recall that previously Sri Krishna had mentioned that this body was a city of 9 gates, a 9-gated thing. Katha Upanishad mentions 11 gates. It mentions that these belong to some entity which is unborn. The body is born, is ajna, and that it is avakra, that is, its consciousness is not crooked or disturbed in any way. Even if you light a lamp or a candle, you'll find some flickering motion there. and described, of course, in the 6th chapter, like a lamp in a windless place, if you recall. If we bring all these ideas together, what we find is this concept of gates in the body coming up. All the gates of the body closed. This is a repetition of the meditation process called pratyahara, withdrawing the limbs, as it were, withdrawing the energy from hearing, seeing, touching, tasting, all the senses, so that the attention can be steered inward. Consciously doing this as a kind of final meditation, with all the gates of the body closed, the mind confined within the heart. What is within the heart? The heart is the emperor, the ruler of this 11-gated city. That ruler doesn't go anywhere. It is constantly there. Its presence allows all the functions of the body, like any other city, containing its waste disposal, containing its traffic, its own M50, its own independent administrators of the different functions. Having fixed his life energy in the head, engaged in firm yoga, head meaning this final royal entrance called Brahmarandra, this final gate that the Katha Upanishad mentions. 9 gates don't mention it, but the Katha Upanishad adds 2 more gates to 7 gates here in the head: eyes, ears, nostrils, mouth. And then, of course, procreation, evacuation is also there, but additional ones, where life began. This is the navel, where life began. And then the royal entrance hall, the royal entrance that is there called Brahmarandra, where the royal ruler enters and leaves. Uttering in the head, engaged in firm yoga concentration, with the mind not wavering, in a single-mindedness, uttering the one-syllabled symbol of Brahman, the indescribable. And what is that sound? Om. Thinking of me, in other words, we can think of it in a personal way also, who departs, leaving the body, attains the supreme goal. That is, this Brahma Nirvana is a supreme goal which is attained, in fact, by the yogi. And so, in this way, we can see how we depart, as it were. We have to add as it were, because our intrinsic nature is that. And so this is how the yogi brings his embodied existence to an end. As the river enters the ocean, the individual consciousness of the yogi merges in his cosmic consciousness, what we previously described as Mahat, which is Brahman. And the activities of the body and the senses all cease as when going to sleep. As a bird returns to a tree to roost, the mind of the yogi gets settled in his heart. That is, not the physical heart, the central core, central position at the time of death. And contrary to this, the mind of the worldly person wanders woefully on mundane things, and we bring to mind also the story of 2 birds on the tree contained in the Mundaka Upanishad. One of them shining and perfect, the other one disturbed and restless, representing the worldly mindedness in a sense. And so cold spreads all over the body, because as the dying person enters into death, we'll find this energy leaves the body in local areas, here and there, so that a person registers, oh, that person is cold here, and now they're cold there. So as a traveler goes to a vehicle station, the prana, energy of the yogi, finally comes to the head. And for this reason, the yogi's head is the last region from which warmth vanishes. It is yoga dharana, for the mind to be fixed in Ishvara at the time of departure. The sound vibration Om at that point persists then. The spiritual content of this vibration is experienced as infinite bliss and also brilliance, of the pure consciousness that is reflected there. This Brahma Nirvanam is the supreme goal attained by this yogi. Ramakrishna gives this: the formative thought that dominates the mind of the one who leaves the body is the factor that governs and contributes to the next birth of this individual. And spiritual discipline is therefore imperative to one and all. Anything short of it becomes a delaying tactic, my comment. The devotee of the Lord, he says, is ever immersed in the thought of God, and always immersed in that condition. Being firmly fixed in it, he reaches the Lord on giving up the body. Another way of saying is being fixed on it, having a purity, constantly a purity of mind. And so what is the way of getting fixed in thought of God? How can we manage that? The next stanza explains. Ananya chetaha satanam yo mam smarati nityasaha tasyaham sulabha partha nitya yuktasya yoginaha. He says and gives us all encouragement. I, standing in this role of the Supreme, am easily attainable by that ever steadfast yogi, that's the difficult part, who constantly remembers me daily and thinks of none else. Now if we jump to the 12th chapter, which we won't do, but just a suggestion of it, many questions are asked about the difficulty of keeping the mind fixed on the Lord. And several alternatives, progressive alternatives, are also suggested. If you can't do this, do that. If you can't do that, do this. It was in the life of Girish Chandra Ghosh that an objection comes about spiritual practice. I don't think I can do all of this. Then why don't you do this, says Ramakrishna. Why don't you think of God, before your meals or when you eat? No, I don't think I can do that. My lifestyle is a bohemian. Ultimately, it boiled down to, then you don't have to do anything. I'll do it for you. So give me your power of attorney was the last statement on it. That sounds like a very easy way of doing things. I resign, you do it for me, that's fine. I can do what I like. No, but I cannot. Because I give you the power of attorney, I have no rights anymore. Now once Girish Chandra Ghosh says, I think I'll do this tomorrow. Ramakrishna made a correction. No, who are you to say that you'll do it? He reminded him that I have your power of attorney. And then he learned this complete reliance and dependence is not an easy path. You surrender your own independence and you're completely dependent on the Lord. But what a beautiful fruit that emerges from it. And so, thinking of God daily, there are various mechanisms for it. What is the spiritual practice? We've mentioned before what constitutes steady practice. Doing the same thing at the same period of time. Not being conscious of the time, by the way, because that creates an anxiety. You become a watcher of a watch. See? And you see, if you treat this kind of sadhana spiritual practice in the same way that you treat any other attainment, then you'll only create anxiety for yourself. There's no such thing as competitive meditation. So I think it was in the Enneagram we made people laugh a little bit about the concept of it. See? There's a cartoon I saw, very beautiful, funny cartoon. There's monks, shaven heads and so on, probably Buddhist monks, standing on the starting line, you see. Meditation, ready, go. Competitive meditation, no, nothing like that, see. And then this idea of this Om is the final attainment, described in this way, and is suggestive of a repetition of that. And so lovingly repeating God's name is also a way of remembering. If you repeat something, it means, of course, you don't know it. But repetition allows you to do it. I give you a definition, you see, of knowledge. Knowledge is the cessation of the necessity to repeat. Can we test it out? Yes. You don't have to get up in the morning and repeat, my name is this, my name is this. You know it already. When you no longer have to repeat something, it's called knowledge. So, Sri Ramakrishna has this to say on it. When we take one stride toward the Lord, He takes 10 strides toward us. What a wonderful thing. And we are reminded of His description of God's grace. That means you have but the wind of God's grace is ever flowing, you but have to set your sail. And I often say, is it easy to set your sail though? Anybody who's taken up sailing will know that just dismissing a statement such as, oh, all you have to do is set your sail is an underestimation of the work that's required. You have to get the mast. You have to, with great effort, fix the mast, erect it, make sure it's stable, connect all the various ropes that direct a sail so that it always faces into the wind. And on a bigger boat, the arrangement for that is much more complex. You know the principle of sailing. There's one word, one useful principle in sailing, duck. Because there's a beam that comes across, cross beam, and when the wind direction changes and the beam swings across, if you don't duck, you'll at minimum get a severe headache. It's a lesson in life. We can use that as an analogy for many things in life. So setting the sail, but setting the sail in terms of sailing is the minimal action that we have to do. Because no amount of huffing and puffing on the sail will move it. The wind automatically does it. Even if the boat is not in the window and you experimentally raise up a sail, ready for sailing, the wind wants to carry it. It's a very, very powerful thing. So it's a wonderful comfort that we have this understanding, you put it in Christian language, which says, we have the angels making all the crooked paths straight for us. Automatically these obstacles are removed. Our intention has to be strong. Just walking on a path, we have to have an intention. We have to know where the route is. We have to know what the various obstacles and difficulties will be there to avoid. But the path is laid out for us, and the obstacles get removed for us, provided we have that intention to walk. The lion's share is not done by us. And so, one step in that direction yields 10 steps toward us. Mam upetya punarjanma dukkhalayam ashashvatam napnyu vanti mahatmanaha samshidhim paramam gataha. Having come to me, the great souls are no more subject to rebirth, which is, of course, transitory and the abode of pain, for they have reached the highest perfection. A man gets whatever he has made for himself, or whatever he constructs as being worthy of, and the Lord gives Himself over to the devotee, worthy of Him, and there is really no gain greater than this. Having gained that supreme, the devotee is in eternal beatitude. And then the wheel of birth and death does not touch him anymore. What do we mean by that? We mean, just to remind you, that everything is cyclical. And we are caught in a cycle of birth, life, decay, growth as well, and finally death. And that continues. And I've said many times before, if you want to be logical about it, in some way, with a cyclical model, then we ask, what is the preconditional cause for death? Well, you have to be born. Thereafter, it's all on the way. And then, with that same logic, what is the precondition to birth, death? How to get out of this cycle of pain, pleasure, birth, life, death syndrome? This is the way. The difference between the wheel of birth and death, which we call samsara, and the eternal beatitude, we explained in this, and then we finish off. So all worlds, including that of Brahma, are subject to return. But on reaching me, that is, that Supreme, there is no rebirth. We get this final freedom. Now that requires a little bit of explanation, and so I'll introduce the explanation here and we'll pick it up as the next stanza for next week. There's often this confusion by students of Vedanta, Brahman, Brahma, etc., Nirguna Brahman, Saguna Brahman, etc. So we have to have a very clear idea of the structure of things, and it requires repeating until we get it. Every system uses the structure, the laid out principle structure of Sankhya. That is at minimum 24 principles. And so these principles, they range in subtlety. Where do the bulk of these principles come from? Where do all these principles come from? In terms of this universe. This universe means this nature, seen and unseen. Our familiar world is understood to us and is seen, is tangible to us. But one thing we know, and one thing science endorses, things are not what they seem to be. And the illustration of that is what I just told you. We have a concept of an atom. We have no understanding of the distance between electron and its nucleus, wherein the proton is there. And yet, this attraction between electron and proton is there. So half a mile away, or 0.8 of a kilometer away, we find still this attraction is there, this relationship that keeps things stable. Neither positive nor negative. Each one cancelling the other one out. And yet enormous activity taking place. If you ask what is an electron, and somebody says, from a technical point of view, an excitation in Hilbert space, it doesn't help you one iota. We can only visualize it in terms of a planetary system, that kind of thing. And we learn this at school because it's a convenient, two-dimensional way of explaining it. But it's not how it is. We discussed how the human body is largely just empty space. If you crunch it down, it's like a grain of sand. We've discussed how the whole of humanity, 7 billion people, will be condensed into one apple, or the size of an apple, once you remove the void. Furthermore, at the most fundamental level, this is our superficial level, because all our understanding and knowledge comes from our interpretation of what is there. We have no idea what is there. But our interpretation of it is, there's a you and a me and a table and a chair and a this and a that. And the sun rises in the morning. In that sense, our interpretation creates our world for us. And so, part of these principles will be the sense organs, which are 10, receptive and reactive. And we have a unit which we can consolidate, even though it has its own parts, called mind. If we wanted, we could make other principles within it as well, but it's a mind. So 16 in all are these gross principles. But behind it is the waves that produced it. And this combination of waves that behave as particles as seen by us is what quantum mechanics calls the world of quantum. And we have discovered these. The ancient sages discovered these energetic levels a long time ago, because expressed in energetic ways, there are 5 of them, 2 of which in relatively modern times we can combine. Electromagnetism we can combine. But these other ones were discovered, leaving out strong and weak nuclear forces. So we already have this understanding. Through yogic insight, it's there. How else could it be? And so these subtle things, these tanmatras are there. That is, God's radiation spread through as waves. And all waves emanate from thought and a thinker. And this cosmic thinker is called this Mahat, this Brahma. Cosmic mind, cosmic consciousness. Call it what you like. Cosmic Christ, cosmic Buddha. Call it what you will. And this becomes the creator, and therefore there is a world, but it is also temporary. because anything that comes that is other than this imperishable must be inevitably perishable. But what is this Brahma? It is this personal God. And so Vedanta is a wonderfully Catholic principle. A wonderful Catholic teaching which says we accept all, we reject none, but we have supplementary positions. Is there material? Does it look like that? Yes. It looks like material is there, and that's all that's there only because the range of the senses and the mind only incorporates a certain enclosed world, as it were, a certain limitation. And the limitations are space and time and causation. But when you view it from a different thing, when you have additional approaches and ways of looking at things, then things will either look less than that or more than that, or certainly different from it. And then these principles are there, very subtle, fairly recently discovered in our science. Not so long ago, energy was not a term used in science or understood. And then the understanding came and it was phrased as force. Newton's force laws are there. But where did these all come from? So it looks like, to the idealist, only mind is there. We agree. But there's more. Forget the alone only. Don't make any exclusive statement at this point. There's more. Continue your investigation. Like the other day reading, you see from Gospel of Ramakrishna, in a conversation with Vidyasagar, there it was, that about a person who wanted to investigate or had a calling. Please, go further, go deeper, and into a wood where you will discover not just ordinary wood but sandalwood. And then you go deeper in the forest, you will find more. You'll find silver, you'll find gold and jewels and so on. The deeper you go, the more you'll find. The more treasure you'll find. What is truth is a treasure. And so we'll discover that this world of Brahma also is temporary. So yes, there is a God. But there's more. There's more than a personal God. A formless entity is there, a potential is there, a causal entity is there, another principle is there. This great cosmic mind, Mahat, is the 23rd principle. And then we find 16 plus 5 plus egos. So beyond that is another principle. We call this Prakriti, nature, completely. And everything ultimately, periodically, will dissolve into that. And I mentioned briefly the number of human calculated years that will take place in. Eons and eons of time. Don't worry about it. And then ultimately, that all is in the nature of the perishable, because it comes and it goes. And beyond that, we find this imperishable, this Akshara Brahma. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.